Good morning. Welcome to Unfolding the Word. Yesterday, we began looking at the fourth chapter of First Peter. I want to continue our examination this morning. I'm going to pick up our reading, looking at essentially the same verses that we began to look at yesterday. First Peter chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves in the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased to sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. The issue before us really is, for what will we live our lives in this world? For who will we live our lives in this world? And really, as I said yesterday, the choice comes down to two fundamental choices. I am either going to live my life in this world ultimately for my will, or I'm going to live my life in this world ultimately for the will of God. Big issues in lots of ways, and yet fundamentally a simple, straightforward sort of decision. Who do I live for? And the warning that we saw yesterday is that if we are choosing as redeemed children of God now, because we're talking about believers, if I choose as a redeemed children of God to live my life for my purposes, for my will, I will end up wasting my life. And that is a sad outcome of a limited time in this world. How do I make sure that I don't waste my life? Great question, important question, and it is to that our verses continue to expand and answer. Paul, in these verses, in these opening verses in the fourth chapter, gives us three key commands, three key challenges, we can even think of them in that way, that help us to be sure that we are living for the will of God. Help us to be sure that we are not squandering or wasting our lives. Remember, even a believer can be choosing to live for their own will and purpose, meaning they are the ones running their life. They may have a spiritual piece to it. They may give God certain parts of it, but they're still in the driver's seat. They're still sitting on the throne of their life. And God says, that means you are living for your will, even when some of your will is to do what I would like you to do. Who is the master of our life? As Romans 12:1 puts it, who have we surrendered and sacrificed our life for? We are to yield up our lives as a sacrifice to the Lord. Well, at any rate, let's look at these three commands. In verse 1, he tells us, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves in the same way of thinking. We begin by solving this problem of wasting life by arming ourselves with Christ's attitude towards suffering. We've looked at the issue of suffering in chapter 2, verses 21 to 25. And these attitudes of suffering, which are reflected in the Lord Jesus Christ, God tells us here can arm us. Interesting way to translate it. The Greek idea here means to weaponize, to give weapons to provide armor for. Isn't it interesting? To see and understand how Christ approached suffering gives us armor to face our own, as long as we adopt what Jesus did. Now, what did Jesus do? What did we learn in the end of the second chapter about his attitude towards suffering? And you remember what that was. He was willing to suffer if it served God's purpose. He could accept it from the hand of God because it served a bigger purpose and an ultimate purpose that was a good one in the hands of God. And so here's the question before you this day. Are you hesitant to follow God's leadership, to give him the reins of your life, put him in the driver's seat, let him sit in the throne of your life? Are you hesitant to do that because it could lead to some suffering in your life? In many cases, probably most of us have answered, yeah, I am hesitant. And what God says to you is, think about Jesus, understand how he approached it, and trust God's purpose if in fulfilling his will for your life, suffering comes with it. an alien trusts his heavenly Father. Do you trust your heavenly Father? Remember Jesus in the garden? Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. It's okay to not want suffering, but nevertheless, God's will. So we arm ourselves with that mentality. Suffering if it serves God's purpose. How do we make sure we're not wasting our life in this world, living under our own control instead of surrender to the control of God? First of all, by how we view suffering. Arm ourselves with Christ. Secondly, he tells us here, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Cease from sin and determine to live a holy life. That fundamental decision for the redeemed believer leads to a life that is productive, not wasted. Certainly that idea of letting him be the Lord, ceasing from sin, living in holiness, permeates chapter 1, permeates chapter 2, and certainly we encountered it in chapter 3 of 1 Peter, as we do throughout the scriptures. Holiness and suffering are often interrelated issues. To cease from sin means to get release from the captivity of it. So here's the question. How does determining to cease from sin relate to suffering? How does suffering help us to understand how to cease from sin? And I think there's a couple answers to that. Suffering, first of all, helps us to sort out what's really important in life and what isn't. We are often pulled away from letting Christ be Lord because certain things start to seem to be important to us, whereas suffering reveals their true nature, and we realize, well, maybe that's not so important after all. Also, suffering tends to put the eternal in focus for us. And in doing so, it reduces sin's short-term appeal, because as Hebrews tells us, sin has a short-term appeal. It seems to yield pleasure for a season, but in the long run, it doesn't yield that, and it yields only disaster. And so suffering tends to sort out the deceptions. And certainly suffering makes us discontented, because God designed it in that way, discontented to be controlled by sin. Are you learning to cease from sin? When my determination is to determine to live a holy life and cease from sin, not 100% perfectly, of course, but oriented that way, then I will increasingly be a person whose life counts rather than wasted. The third thing he talks about here is he says, in verse 2, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. God says the third of these attitudes, these commands, these perspectives that will help you not to waste your life, is determining to live the rest of it for God's will, not for your own will. The fact is, God understands, because he's created us, that every one of us, at least secretly, wants our life to count. We want to know that our life in this world matters, that we've accomplished something, that it made a difference we are alive. Even the unredeemed want to believe that. And God says, listen, if you are living surrendered to my will, it will make a difference that you're alive. You will have a satisfaction. In fact, the only way that your life doesn't prove a zero is when it's under the control of God and Christ is Lord, because then we are being used for eternally significant reasons and purposes. Each of us decides, how will my life be spent? Will I live it from here on out for the will of God, or will I live it continuing what has been true before, of being the Lord of my own life, deciding what I'll do and what I don't want to do, even if I'm leaving a place for God in it. I was thinking of that classic classic quote from C.T. Studd, that great missionary to China of a previous generation. And he said this, only one life will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Isn't that a great quote? And I think it gets to the heart of some of the issues here in the opening part of the 4th chapter of 1 Peter. It really comes down to a question of lordship. Who is Lord? It is possible for a redeemed child of God to not be living with Christ as the Lord of their life. And God says, listen, redeemed child of God, adopted child living now in my family, don't waste what's left of your life in this world. Live it for my will, and let Christ be Lord. Let us steer your life, sitting in the control center. Is that going to be true for your life? Well, join me tomorrow as we continue this study. And in verses 3 through 6, we begin to look at some of the ways in which the person who does not know the Lord, the pagan in this world, ends up squandering life. And it's a good measure for us. Have we drifted into some of those things? Join me then, won't you? God bless.